I rarely offer commentary on American politics, but I think it's relevant these days because recently Bernie Sanders overtook Hillary Clinton in New Hampshire and beat her in a rather spectacular way. And everyone's thinking anything is possible. Now, a lot of this is credited to the youth, the youthful Americans, the millennials supporting Bernie Sanders. So I want to talk about Bernie Sanders and why the youth is supporting him and some of the problems that he's going to face, as well as some of the, frankly speaking, ignorance and idiocy of the people supporting him. So let's dive into it. Now, I'm not going to critique Bernie Sanders' policy ideas in of themselves. That would require 3 hours. Needless to say, in summary, my view of Bernie Sanders is that he is one of these utopianists, egalitarians. It's all just a pipe dream, and it's just none of the things he's talking about are actionable, not really. And there are a lot of reasons for that, but I don't agree with the vast majority of what he has to say, but that's not what this video is about. Why is he winning with the youth? Well, if you ask Bernie Sanders, he'll say, because the youth, that is, young people, are idealistic and they want to get things done and bring about change in the world and so on and so forth. Well, he might actually believe that. I don't know. Can't read Bernie Sanders' mind, frankly speaking. But that's not why the American youth is supporting Bernie Sanders. Who is this youth? Well, by and large, they fit the category of millennial. Now, millennial, as far as I can understand it, roughly stretches from being born in 86 into the 90s at some point in time, mostly into the 90s. And so that's where most of his youthful support is coming from. Now, I'm an old fuck, born in the 70s, so I'm not a millennial. But it's hard not to say, and this is anecdotal because you just have to observe certain things, and sometimes I'll offer anecdotal evidence. But the millennials overall, on so many levels, for example, are just they're some of the dumbest, most poorly educated Americans I've encountered ever. Many of them lack basic literacy and numeracy skills. They're scientifically illiterate. But more importantly, they are entitled as fucking hell. Now, every generation in every particular cultural niche bears the brunt of how they were raised as a generation, what was sort of acculturated into them. And I would argue that millennials, and you can see it in their behavior, so all these SJWs, and the vast majority, some of them are my generation, most of them are millennials, they fit the picture of entitlement culture. I mean, some of them, if you'd interview them, I imagine, might quite literally believe that milk and honey, as John Galt once said, would flow freely from the sky, as if produced from nothing. And you can see this. There's evidence for this. Well, let's look at the Take Back Wall Street movement. I mean, yeah, it wasn't just millennials, but there were many of them there. And it started off as a kind of good idea, right? Government in bed with corporations. That's bad. I think anyone with sense doesn't want corporations in bed with the government because it leads to all kinds of cronyism and crony capitalism and all kinds of things like that. Good idea. Shouldn't have bailed out these companies. They should have been liquidated and more competent people should have taken over. Okay. But over time, it devolved into something completely different, basically entitlement culture. Give me free shit. Give me bailouts. Give me this and that. Absolutely insane. Turned into sort of a pot-smoking hippie movement of just profound ignorance is bliss as a principle. So you need to understand the youthful Bernie Sanders support from the perspective of millennial. And I'm not a millennial, and I'm reasonably well educated, so I have to actually just observe things as I know. I have some millennial friends, but they tend to be more exceptions than the rule. And even in the few cases where I am friends with them, I think they do suffer from a lack of education in some regards. But the entitlement culture ultimately is what's driving Bernie Sanders' support in the youth. Because Bernie Sanders is promising free shit. He's saying, I'm going to give you free healthcare. I'm going to give you free education. And who wouldn't react really well to that? And more importantly, who in the millennial generation, the generation of entitlement, the generation that believes everything should just be given to them, handed to them, who would not, jumping for joy, accept that and want that as a principle? There are two elements, and I'll be talking about the other elements soon. That is the major driving force. I mean, you can see this in the phenomenon of, oh, we're going to give you free education. Now, the American higher education system is totally fucked up. Government in bed with universities giving out, loans, and then with inflated currency losing value, and universities hiking up tuition, and it's a big mess. And that would be a separate video, and lots of other people have talked about it. But it's a big mess. The government shouldn't be involved, and so on and so forth. But a lot of students these days are asking for debt forgiveness. They think that they can bear no responsibility for the poor choices they made. I think all of us who've lived a few decades have made poor choices. Years ago, when I was living in Germany in a different time, in a different place, when I was a younger man, I made some poor choices. I associated with a borderline personality ex-wife. I was stressed out. I was studying the wrong thing probably at the end of the day. And ultimately, I ended up going broke, and my only way out of that situation was to head to South Korea. And even though it was financially very rewarding, I worked like a dog, sometimes 6, 7 days a week, and my health was very poor psychologically. It was just, it was a horrible time. I was probably most miserable then, and it's hard to say. Saved a lot of money, but now one thing, but that's just an example of, I had to bear the brunt, the responsibility for poor choices I made, and that's just life, right? When I was considering going to university in the mid '90s, and I ended up, that's when I started in the mid '90s. I had a couple of choices. I could choose a public university, much much cheaper, or a few sort of below the notch Ivy League universities, so not quite Yale, Harvard, but places like Columbia and University of Pennsylvania, places like Northwestern, and so pretty fairly elite universities, none of whom were going to give me financial aid. So I could have gone there if I'd taken out loans. Instead, I chose to go the public route. I got a pretty good education, I'd argue, and because it was much much cheaper, I was able to afford it, and I have no university debt. Later on, to get my master's degrees, well, I had worked in South Korea and saved a shit ton of money, and I paid for those degrees with that money, by and large. But the students these days who, let's say they study Aztec anthropology or some nonsense like that, not knocking anthropology as a discipline, and then expect to just find work, and then expect that everything will be fine. I mean, yeah, there is a fucked up situation with regards to tuition and university fees in the United States. But if it's fucked up and it can't be changed, at least immediately, you need to think with your head, you need to be wise, you need to show forbearance, and you need to show restraint. So then you need to think, well, maybe it's not the best thing to study Aztec or Mayan anthropology at Yale and in the process go $150,000 in debt, considering my job prospects are terrible to non-existent. Maybe that wasn't the best idea, but instead, the millennial generation says, well, I wanted to study this, and that's what I wanted, and I should just have my debt forgiven. Or university should just be free. This is a pipe dream. I mean, Bernie Sanders is sort of a living, walking, talking pipe dream. But this is just so typical of the entitlement generation, the millennial generation that thinks that, yeah, milk and honey can flow from the sky and they can get everything they want and there's no problem, and there should be no debt there should be debt forgiveness, and everything should be free, everything, and I can study what I want, and there's no consequence to anything. I mean, at the end of the day, this is what third wave feminism is: a bunch of fucking entitled millennials, and by and large. I think Sarkeesian is in my generation. I'm not sure which would be generation X, Y. I lose track. And that's why he appeals in large measure to the youth, because he's offering them free shit, and they think they deserve free shit. But there's another element to this, and this goes back to what I said about the level of ignorance concerning the millennial generation in the United States. Once again, they tend to be inarticulate. They have poor writing skills, poor reading skills, poor arithmetic skills, scientifically illiterate by and large. They're good at working with electronics devices, I'll give them that, and they can surf the net really well. But what we see here is also an ignorance of how the American legal and government system works. So let's just say that what were not a factor. That it's not because Bernie Sanders is promising them free shit. Let's just say they think that it has merits and they believe in all these principles. Well, there's another factor involved, and that is the fact of the matter is that most Americans these days do not have a fucking clue as to how the American government actually works. They probably couldn't tell you they might be able to tell you the First Amendment. They probably couldn't tell you very much about the Fifth or the Fourth. And a lot of these amendments, like the 10th or the 10th, or the 10th Amendment, which is an important one, which tells you that the powers that aren't explicitly stated in the Constitution are given to the state. Now, this is federal government overrides state law all the time, or has often at least done this. But they probably couldn't tell you very much beyond the First Amendment, maybe the Second Amendment, in the case of some gun fanatics. But that's pretty much it. They and it doesn't. They don't really even apply to the daily lives. So what about how the government actually works? What are the branches of government? Now, Americans, you'll forgive me if I bore you. I do have a lot of non-Americans as an audience. Now, when I was growing up, getting educated, you had to learn this stuff, and it was almost beaten into you. Not literally, obviously, metaphorically. The American government has three branches of government, and there are reasons for this. Now, I don't want to give the history lesson here, but for the non-Americans, there are three branches of government: the executive branch, which is the president; the legislative branch, which is composed of Congress, senators, and the House of Representatives; and the judicial branch. And I'll explain what all of these do. But I'm going to argue here that most of what Bernie Sanders promises isn't even actionable, because that is not the nature of the office that he seeks to occupy, which is to say, the executive branch does not create or pass laws. It can veto stuff, and we'll get to that in a bit. Let's talk about arguably the most important branch of the American government, the legislative branch, which, as I said, is composed of Congress, the Senate, and the House of Representatives. Congress actually makes the laws, and between the Senate and the House of Representatives, the laws are debated, their merits, and they can be ratified or passed as actual legislature. The president then can veto certain things, and these vetoes can be overridden. Now, veto in this context simply means I vote against it. But the president himself does not manufacture legislature. He does not create actual laws. And in this particular domestic context, the legislative branch is vastly more powerful than the president. Right? So, once again, Congress makes the laws, and then the Senate and the House of Representatives debate the laws, and they decide whether they get passed or not. Finally, you have the law going to the president, and he can sign it in or not. So he can veto it, but this veto can be overridden, and it has happened many times. What is the executive branch? And by way of contrast, the President of the United States, he's essentially the chief of the armed forces. He is the commander-in-chief. So let's theoretically talk about what Bernie Sanders could do if he became the President of the United States. Well, he would be the de facto leader of the American armed forces. Right? Theoretically, he could withdraw all American troops off of foreign soil. For example, our satellite countries, such as South Korea and Japan. We've been there for just endless decades. And some people want them there and other people don't. Okinawans are a good example. They don't really want the Americans there anymore. I've looked at polls, and there's a lot of noise pollution, among other things, and occasional issues of violence and physical mistreatment of the locals. And it's occasional, but it's disturbing. Tokyo in bed with Washington doesn't really work out too well, but in theory, he could just say, we're getting out of Okinawa, and we're withdrawing all our troops from South Korea, and we're leaving Western Germany, and all of this stuff. In theory, he could do that, but because the government is in bed with numerous vested interests, the military and industrial complex is not a conspiracy. It's not a myth. It's there. They're, Halliburton, and so on. They're there, and they would not allow that to happen. They like getting their money. They like the American satellite empire. So, that theoretically he could do that, but probably wouldn't pass. So think about another thing: lobbyists. I don't know what Bernie Sanders' position is on Israel. I've always been completely neutral on Israel. That is, I don't care one way or another what happens to it. I'm not for it. I'm not against it. And I feel the same way about Palestine. Most people take sides. I don't care. I've long argued, for example, that there should be no American tax revenue be going to any of these countries, not to Egypt, not to Israel. I mean, you're hard-pressed to argue that a farmer in Iowa or Idaho has nothing to do with Israel or Egypt. How are his interests being represented there? Specifically, the interests are Israeli interests and the Egyptian interests. They're not American interests per se. There are, however, powerful lobbying groups such as AIPAC that will lobby, and this is why we have a sort of pro-Israeli policy. And I'm not anti-Israel. I'm not pro. I'm neutral Israel. I care mostly about the United States and Europe. I live in Europe. I'm European, and I was born in the United States, and I care about what's going on there too. I don't give a shit what's happening in that disgusting, barren strip of land that people have been fighting over for millennia. I understand the historical implications of it, but it baffles me. It's a fucking shithole by and large, and honestly, I just wish that those groups would just fight it out and leave the rest of the world alone. But we always get sucked into it. So I don't know what Bernie Sanders' policy is, but let's say he were Israel, Palestine, Egyptian neutral. Let's say he just said, I have nothing against these people. Let them kill each other. That's my attitude. But we're not going to give them American money to facilitate the back and forth. There's no way he could do that because, AIPAC and very strong lobbying interests oppose that. So, once again, in theory, he could withdraw military support from these areas, but practically, because of military-industrial complex interests, because of Israeli interests, and so on and so forth, it just wouldn't happen. So just there's a lot of examples of how ineffectual the president actually is in a large measure. Now, certain things have changed for the foreigners and non-Americans. You used to need a congressional declaration of war. This hasn't happened since the end of World War II. Technically speaking, every war we've entered into has been illegal according to American law since that time. Korean War, Vietnam, so on and so forth. Now, people think that's antiquated, but there was a reason why you needed congressional approval to weigh the merits of entering into a conflict. We don't really do that anymore. We're pretty headstrong about basically everything, and hey, maybe the rules have changed. Finally, there is the judicial branch, which is basically the Supreme Court. And this branch is all about interpreting things and what is appropriate and what's not, what's constitutional. Most of the time, the Supreme Court weighs in on issues of constitutional law. Now, in the United States, things can go pretty far. So you can start with a municipal case that is limited to a city or a specific area. Then it can go to the state level. And if there's still issues with that, it can go to the Supreme Court in Washington, that is where it is interpreted and then can become the law of the land, such as the case of Roe versus Wade. I believe 1970, I think. Don't quote me on that. That's just off the top of my head. Now, these three branches of government, I would argue, are things that most of these millennials have no clue about. My impression is that they probably couldn't even name the branches of government, many of them, and the vast majority of them could not tell you what the branches do, because once again, why would they buy into the idea that Bernie Sanders can give them lots of free shit if they know just how limited the executive branch, the presidency, is? And there are good reasons for that. The so-called founding fathers wanted to prevent tyranny. They wanted to prevent the resurgence of a king, the resurgence of absolute power, of absolutism, and that's why we have these different branches of government that allow an adjudication of different things rather than fiat decree. But, once again, if you are a millennial, you think, Bernie Sanders is going to be free education, free healthcare, free everything. You remember that woman back in the day?
It was the most memorable time of my life. It was a touching moment because I never thought this day would ever happen. I won't have to worry about putting gas in my car. I won't have to worry about paying my mortgage. If I help him, he's going to help me.
Now, it's true, she was not a millennial. She's probably my generation, but her kind is sort of typical. by her kind, I mean I just want free shit, not making any sort of reference to anything else. And I'm arguing that that has been multiplied manifoldly in the millennial generation. People want free shit, politicians promise to them, but the fact of the matter is these people, just as she didn't know that Obama could never keep these promises, the millennials mistakenly believe that, oh yeah, we're going to support Sanders because he's going to give us free shit. How is he going to do that? If they don't understand how the American government works, how the legislative process works, how the executive branch works, then they should know. If they understood that, they wouldn't be supporting him on this because they know he can't do these things, practically speaking. Practically speaking as well because of the opposition he would face, because of their vested interests. How did Obamacare get passed? Well, basically because corporate interests thought it was a good idea. And if they don't think it's a good idea, they're not going to support it. And there's so much money in politics and so many lobbying interests. It's not just, I use AIPAC as an example. It's not just AIPAC. There are tons of others. How is that going to ever happen? This applies even to his position as commander-in-chief. How is he going to actually do stuff, by and large, unless it's in concert with what the military-industrial complex want and various other interests, such as Israel? How? He's not. So these people are just profoundly ignorant. It's a shame. It's a shame that the American youth has come to this. And once again, you could have a debate on the merits of the ideas themselves, but they're not actionable. And they're not going to be implemented because they cannot be implemented. The generation of I want my free shit and not have to do anything, and I don't ever want to bear responsibility for any of the mistakes I make. Yeah, they might end up being the doom of us all. But that's all I have to say about that, more or less. For those of you interested, particularly non-Americans, in learning more about the way the American government works and other things, I will be posting some links in the low bar. And for those of you who were not familiar, not Americans, I hope that was enlightening, educational for Americans. Maybe you'd forgotten, maybe not. But I think it's always good to be grounded in reality and how things work. And if you're an American, I think it's important that you know how these things work. This is our cultural heritage, whether we like it or not. Whatever we originally come from, that's how the United States works, and those are the principles it was founded on. So anyway, I have a lot of things planned for the weekend. Two things. Really interesting talks. I don't want to offer false hope, but libertarian realists. And if it works out, I'm really hoping teal deer on perspectives, talking about the UK and England, and teal deer now as a legend. I think it's going to be a very interesting discussion. And until then, I wish you a forthcoming pleasant weekend, wherever you might be, depending on your time zone. And I look forward to your comments as always. And I hope you're enjoying the cold weather. I love the winter. Take care and talk soon. Bye-bye.